The clock on the mahogany desk read 7 p.m. Yoon Kang Dae stood motionless before the floor-to-ceiling glass of his estate, half lit by the warm amber glow of his study and half swallowed by the bruised purple of the twilight outside. 60 acres of manicured gardens stretched out below, a kingdom of silence he had built with surgical precision. To the world, he was a man of iron. His tailored black suit was immaculate, every sharp line reflecting a discipline born from years of blood and shadow. But inside, the silence was a suffocating pressure. Kang Dae's palm was pressed flat against the window, not in desperation, but in a lethal act of restraint. He was a man used to commanding armies, yet here he was, holding himself back, his analytical mind caught in a loop he couldn't solve. His glasses caught the light, sharpening a gaze that was currently fixed on the courtyard below. He checked his platinum watch. She was 3 minutes late. He wasn't a man who allowed variables, and Zuri Bennett was becoming the most dangerous variable in his life. He took a measured breath, his jaw tightening as he watched the perimeter gate. He told himself he was merely monitoring a member of his staff, but the disbelief in his own eyes betrayed him. He was calculating risks and consequences, realizing too late that she had never been just the maid. He was the head of a global network. Men across 3 continents feared his silence. Yet here he was, the most powerful man in the syndicate, obsessed with the arrival of a woman who was supposed to be invisible. The fact that she had this much power over his pulse made him colder than any execution ever had. A pair of headlights cut through the dark at the edge of the estate. Kang Dae's entire body tensed, a predator sensing a shift in the wind. He didn't move away from the glass. He just watched. Zuri Bennett stepped out of the car. She walked toward the house with a quiet, regal elegance, her long braids falling neatly over the shoulders of her fitted black dress. She looked composed, intentional, carrying herself like someone who had learned to survive by observing the world's monsters without ever flinching. She looked like a secret he wasn't ready to share. She took 10 paces toward the entrance before she stopped. She didn't see him behind the glass, but she felt it, that heavy atmospheric shift, the crackle of electricity that always signaled his presence. Zuri looked up, her steady gaze finding the window where he stood. Kang Dae remained a silhouette against the interior light, looking more like a statue than a man. The darkness outside seemed to lean in toward him, framing him as something monstrous and magnificent. His eyes locked onto hers through the glass, a gaze of possession so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You're late, Zuri," he whispered to the empty room, his voice carrying a vibration that sounded dangerously like a crack in his armor. Zuri stood her ground in the cold air, her posture alert, sensing the shift in the wind. She didn't know that behind her, emerging from the shadows of the car, a second silhouette was moving, Marcus Whitlock. The war hadn't just begun, it had already walked onto his front porch. Welcome to the new dynasty. If the sight of a predator closing in while the man you thought was your protector watches from behind glass makes your pulse race, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and drop your city and time in the comments, because tonight, the boundary between service and obsession has finally shattered. The heavy silence of the estate was not merely an absence of sound. It was a rule enforced by Yoon Kang Dae's very presence. Inside the vast, minimalist halls, every surface was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting a life stripped of clutter and sentiment. Zuri Bennett moved through this vacuum with the practiced grace of a shadow, her footsteps silent against the white marble. To any other observer, she was a ghost in a fitted black dress, but to Kang Dae, she was a clockwork necessity, until tonight. As Zuri entered the dining hall to set the evening tea, she felt his gaze before she saw him. Kang Dae was seated at the head of the long obsidian table, his laptop open, the blue light of the screen catching the sharp edge of his jaw and the clinical gleam of his glasses. He didn't look up. He never looked up. For 3 years, their relationship had been defined by this cold, professional distance. She was the hand that placed the cup. He was the power that consumed it. She set the porcelain down with a soft, controlled click. "Your tea, Mr. Yoon. Oolong, steeped for exactly 4 minutes." Kang Dae's fingers paused over the keyboard. The air in the room seemed to thicken, a sudden tension vibrating between them that hadn't been there yesterday. He didn't thank her. In his world, service was expected, and gratitude was a sign of a loose grip. Yet he didn't dismiss her immediately either. He leaned back, his immaculate black suit shifting with a subtle, expensive rustle. "You were late at the gate tonight, Zuri," he said, his voice a low, analytical rasp that cut through the silence like a scalpel. Zuri stood her ground, her long braids draped over her shoulder, her posture perfectly straight. She didn't fidget. She had spent a lifetime learning that to show fear was to invite pursuit. "The perimeter sensors were being calibrated, sir. I waited for the all-clear." It was a lie of omission. She had felt the eyes of Marcus Whitlock in the tree line, but she kept her expression as unreadable as a locked vault. She was a secret, and she intended to stay that way. Kang Dae finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers. Behind the lenses of his glasses, his gaze wasn't just observant, it was predatory. He was searching for a crack in her composure, a hint of the nobody he had hired to blend into the walls, but he found only quiet strength. Zuri didn't look like a victim of his intimidation. She looked like a woman who had survived far worse than a mafia boss's scrutiny. "Efficiency is the only reason you are in this house," he remarked, his tone dropping to a dangerous register. "Do not let the outside world bleed into my halls again." "I understand my place, sir," she replied softly, though her steady eyes challenged the very definition of the word. She turned to leave, her stride purposeful and elegant. She was the invisible woman, the one who saw everything and said nothing. But as she exited, she could still feel his eyes on her back, no longer seeing a servant, but a mystery he couldn't solve. And upstairs, behind the glass of his study, Kang Dae watched her silhouette vanish into the corridor, his heart hammering a rhythm that no amount of surgical restraint could silence. The professional dynamic was a lie they were both starting to tell poorly. The following morning, the sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray mist clinging to the estate, leaving the grounds draped in the cold, damp shroud. Yoon Kang Dae stood in the center of the foyer, his analytical mind already processing the day's logistics, but his focus was derailed by a jagged break in his carefully curated world. Near the servants' entrance, the threshold to Zuri's private quarters, lay a small, incongruous object that felt like a puncture wound in his security. It was a single, charred leather glove, placed with mocking precision on a stone pedestal. As Kang Dae approached, his shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble, the faint, acrid sense of sulfur reached him. It was a smell he knew well, the calling card of Marcus Whitlock. Marcus didn't just kill, he branded his territory with the stench of gunpowder and scorched earth. Kang Dae's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching with a suppressed urge to reach for the weapon concealed beneath his tailored jacket. This wasn't just a security breach, it was a psychological scalpel. Marcus hadn't left the warning at the front gates or in the syndicate's boardroom. He had left it here, inches away from the door where Zuri Bennett slept. The message was loud and clear. "I see what you are hiding. I know what you keep." The sound of a light, rhythmic footfall echoed from the hallway. Zuri appeared, carrying a stack of fresh linens. She stopped short, her steady gaze dropping to the charred glove, then rising to meet Kang Dae's. For a heartbeat, the invisible woman mask faltered. Her nostrils flared at the sense of sulfur, and her pupils dilated with the recognition that confirmed Kang Dae's deepest fear. She knew that scent too. "Mr. Yoon?" she said, her voice a low, cautious vibration.
She didn't ask what it was. She didn't scream. She simply tightened her grip on the linens, her knuckles turning a faint, ashy gray. Kang Dae stepped between her and the glove, his frame expanding to block her view, an instinctive wall of meat and expense of wool. Go back to the kitchen, Zuri. Do not use this entrance for the remainder of the week. He was here, wasn't he? She asked. Her composure was dak, but it was brittle now, like ice over a deep, dark lake. Kang Dae's eyes darkened behind his glasses. The surgical detachment he spent years perfecting was being replaced by a hot, possessive rage. He hated that she had to ask, and he hated even more that he couldn't lie to her. The distance he had fought to maintain was evaporating before him. He is a ghost, and I am the one who haunts ghosts. You are safe inside these walls, as long as you obey my rules. Rules don't stop sulfur from burning, sir, she whispered, a flash of her hidden steel sparking in her eyes. She turned and retreated into the house, but the silence she left behind was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with the coming storm. Kang Dae stared at the glove, the scent of Marcus's malice filling his lungs. He realized then that the secret was no longer a secret. The war had moved from the streets of the city to the very hallway of his heart, and for the first time in his life, Yoon Kang Dae felt the cold, sharp edge of true terror. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing to keep her. The days that followed the discovery of the sulfur-scented glove were marked by a silence so profound it felt like a declaration of war. Yoon Kang Dae did not explain the sudden shift in the estate's atmosphere. He simply dictated it. The perimeter security doubled, their black SUVs circling the grounds like sharks in shallow water. New biometric locks were installed on every exit, and the expansive gardens where Zuri used to walk in the early mornings were suddenly off limits. To Kang Dae, this was a logical fortification, a tightening of the bolt. To Zuri, it was the sound of a cage door clicking shut. By the third evening, the tension between the master and the maid had become a physical presence in the dining room. Kang Dae sat at the head of the table, his eyes never leaving the security monitors displayed on his tablet. He looked more like a commander in a bunker than a man at dinner. Zuri entered with his meal, her movements deliberate and stiff. She placed the silver tray on the table, but instead of retreating into the shadows as she had done for years, she stood her ground. "The South Terrace door won't open for my keycard anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the heavy atmosphere. "And the grocery delivery was turned away at the gate. My world has shrunk to 4 walls and a hallway, Mr. Yoon." Kang Dae didn't look up, his fingers swiping across the screen to check the infrared feed of the North Woods. "It is for your safety, Zuri. The world outside those walls has become unstable. You will remain in the main house until I decide otherwise." "Safety?" Zuri took a step closer, the light of the chandelier catching the fire in her eyes. "You aren't protecting me, you're hiding me. There is a difference between a shield and a shroud." Finally, Kang Dae set the tablet down. He rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow that seemed to swallow the light. He adjusted his glasses, his expression a mask of cold, analytical detachment. "You are an employee of this estate. My primary responsibility is the integrity of this household. If Marcus Whitlock thinks he can use you to get to me, he is mistaken. You are under my jurisdiction now." "I am not a piece of territory," she countered, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "I came here because I needed a place to disappear, not a place to be buried alive. If you keep tightening this grip, you'll find you're guarding an empty room." For a moment, the surgical restraint Kang Dae prided himself on faltered. He saw the secret strength in her, the resilient woman who had survived a past he could only guess at. He wanted to tell her that his heart hammered against his ribs every time a sensor tripped. He wanted to admit that the thought of her in Marcus's hands made the blood in his veins turn to ice. Instead, he stepped into her personal space, his scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco surrounding her like a command. "You will stay where I can see you," he rasped, his eyes dark with a possessive intensity that bordered on desperation. "Then you've already lost," she whispered, her gaze never wavering from his. "Because you're so busy watching the door that you aren't even looking at me." She turned and walked away, leaving the meal untouched. Kang Dae stood in the center of the silent room, his hands trembling slightly. He had built a fortress to keep her safe, but as he watched her disappear into the hallway, he realized he had only succeeded in making himself her jailer. The cage was perfect, but the bird was already beginning to hate the gold.
The storm that had been brewing between them didn't break with a shout. It dissolved into the heavy midnight stillness of the library. Kang Dae had found her there, not cleaning, but standing before a shelf of ancient history, her fingers hovering over the spines as if reading a language only she understood. The security monitors in his hand showed the perimeter was quiet, yet the internal sensors, the ones that monitored the rhythmic thrum of his own chest, were screaming. "You move like someone who spent years learning how to disappear," Kang Dae said, his voice emerging from the shadows of the doorway. He didn't turn on the lights. He preferred her like this, a silhouette framed by the leather-bound knowledge of men who had died for their empires. Zuri didn't flinch. She had grown used to his spectral presence. "In Chicago, the light is a luxury, Mr. Yoon. In the neighborhood where I grew up, being seen was a death sentence. If the gangs didn't notice you, the debt collectors didn't find you. If the police didn't see you, they couldn't blame you." She finally turned, the moonlight through the high windows catching the silver in her eyes. "My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us invisible. She told me that a black girl with a scholarship was a target for anyone who felt small. So I learned to walk without making a sound. I learned to keep my gaze on the floor and my grades in my pocket. I became a ghost long before I ever set foot in your house." Kang Dae took a step forward, the sharp lines of his suit cutting through the dark. He thought of his own scars, the ink on his skin that told tales of survival in the back alleys of Seoul. He had always seen her as a servant, a component of his comfort, but now he saw the truth. She wasn't just a maid. She was a strategist of the shadows, a survivor who had perfected the art of the secret to stay alive. "And the debt?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low clinical register. "My mother's heart gave out before her will did," Zuri whispered. "The hospital bills were a mountain I couldn't climb, and the people who bought that debt don't accept apologies. They accept property. They accept lives. I didn't come to you for a paycheck, Kang Dae. I came to you because your name was the only shadow big enough to hide me." The admission hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Kang Dae felt a surge of something more dangerous than protection. It was a profound, agonizing recognition. They were the same, 2 predators who had built different kinds of armor to protect the same vulnerable core. He realized then that her quiet strength wasn't a personality trait, it was a tactical choice. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the space between them before he finally touched a stray braid near her shoulder. The contact was electric, a bridge built in the darkness. "You spent your life trying to be a nobody so the world wouldn't hurt you," he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "But you made a mistake coming here, Zuri, because I see you. And now that I've seen you, I will never let the world have you back." Zuri didn't pull away. For the first time, she let the mask of the invisible woman slip, revealing the raw, frightened girl beneath. "That's what I'm afraid of," she breathed. In the heart of the fortress, the secret was out, and the silence that followed was the heaviest one yet. The fragile truce of the library was shattered the following afternoon by a sound that Kang Dae would never forget, the high-velocity crack of a sniper's bullet meeting reinforced glass. He was in his study, the air thick with the presence of 3 high-ranking syndicate lieutenants who had traveled from Seoul to discuss a merger that would solidify his global reach. Billions of dollars were on the line, and the men were watching him with the wary respect reserved for a god. Then the window behind him spiderwebbed.
The bullet didn't penetrate. The glass was rated for military-grade projectiles, but the impact was a psychological explosion. Kang Dae didn't flinch, but his eyes instantly darted to the security monitors. His heart stopped. Zuri was in the courtyard, her back to the house, kneeling over a bed of hydrangeas. She was a perfect, unmoving target in the center of the crosshairs. "Mr. Yoon, the contract requires your signature now," the eldest lieutenant urged, oblivious to the predator watching from the tree line. "If we do not finalize this merger today, the Philadelphia families will move in." Kang Dae ignored him, his analytical mind screaming. He saw a second red dot dancing across the white marble of the fountain, inches from Zuri's shoulder. Marcus wasn't trying to kill her yet. He was playing with his food. He was showing Kang Dae exactly how easy it would be to reach out and snuff out the only light in the estate. "The meeting is over," Kang Dae rasped, his voice dropping into a register that made the lieutenants freeze. "Sir? If you walk away from this table, the syndicate will fall into civil war, thousands of lives." "I don't care about the lives of thousands," Kang Dae snapped, finally tearing his eyes from the window. He stood, the chair screeching against the floor like a dying animal. He adjusted his glasses, but his surgical detachment was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. "I care about the one life currently in a madman's sight." He didn't wait for their protests. He bolted from the room, his long strides eating up the distance to the stairs. Behind him, the multi-billion-dollar deal lay discarded like scrap paper. He burst through the terrace doors, the cold air hitting him like a physical blow. "Zuri, get down." She turned, her eyes wide with a confusion that quickly sharpened into terror as she saw the look on his face. She didn't ask questions. She saw the weapon in his hand and the broken glass of the study above. She dived toward the stone lip of the fountain just as a second shot rang out, chipping the granite where her head had been a second before. Kang Dae reached her in a blur of motion, his body shielding hers, his tailored suit jacket pressing against her trembling frame. He pulled her into the alcove of the stone archway, his breath coming in sharp, shallow stabs. "I have you," he whispered, his palm pressing against the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her braids. "I have you." "Your meeting," she breathed, her voice muffled against his chest. "You left them." "Let the empire burn," Kang Dae replied, his eyes scanning the tree line with a lethal, unblinking intensity. "Let it all burn to ash. I am not letting him take you." In that moment, the choice was made. The Mafia boss was dead. The protector had arisen. But as the scent of sulfur drifted once more on the wind, Kang Dae knew the war had officially moved past the point of no return. He had traded his throne for a secret, and he was ready to kill every man on earth to keep it.
The aftermath of the courtyard shooting left the estate in a state of hypervigilance that felt like a dying breath held too long. Kang Dae had retreated into his tactical center, a room of glowing screens and cold steel, trying to calculate the trajectory of a war that no longer followed the rules of logic. Zuri sat in the corner, her braids slightly frayed, her steady gaze fixed on him. She was the anchor he was terrified to drop, the only person who could make the unbreakable boss feel the icy prickle of sweat on his neck. The breach happened at 3:14 a.m. The alarm didn't scream, it hummed, a low-frequency vibration that signaled a systemic failure. Kang Dae's fingers flew across the keyboard, his glasses reflecting the rapid scroll of red code. "They've cut the secondary power," he rasped, his voice a jagged edge in the dim light. "Zuri, get to the safe room, now." He watched her move toward the hidden door behind the mahogany shelving, but as she reached the threshold, a single monitor flickered to life. It showed the north gate. There, standing in the middle of the rain-slipped drive, was Marcus Whitlock. He wasn't hiding. He was holding a remote detonator, and his eyes were fixed directly on the camera lens. In that heartbeat, Kang Dae's analytical mind, the surgical processor that had kept him alive for decades, betrayed him. He saw the detonator, and his mind began to calculate the blast radius of the C4 planted at the structural pillars of the West Wing. If he stayed to protect Zuri, the house would collapse, killing them both. If he ran to intercept Marcus, he would leave her alone. He hesitated.
For 47 agonizing seconds, the man of action became a man of thought. He weighed the syndicate's survival against her heartbeat. He measured the distance of the hallway against the speed of a thumb pressing a button. His brain was a storm of variables, a chaotic mess of if-then statements that led only to ash. Kang Dae? Zuri's voice was a soft, terrifying tether to reality. He looked at her, his jaw tight, his soul caught in the gears of a machine that had finally broken. "Stay there," he commanded, but the authority in his voice was hollow, cracked by a fear he couldn't name. He chose to strike. He bolted toward the hallway, intending to take Marcus out before the trigger could be pulled. It was a tactical decision, the correct move in any manual of war. But as he rounded the corner, he heard the sound that would haunt his nightmares, the muffled thud of a flashbang and the shattering of the very glass he had used to watch her. He skidded to a halt, spinning back, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the safe room door just as a black SUV roared away from the side entrance, its tires screaming against the gravel. The safe room was empty, the window was a jagged hole, and the only thing left behind was a single scorched leather glove resting on the floor where she had stood. Kang Dae collapsed against the doorframe, his glasses sliding down his nose, his breath coming in ragged, broken gasps. His hesitation had been the opening Marcus needed. He had calculated the risk, but he had failed to account for the one variable that mattered. Marcus didn't want the house, he wanted the secret, and in 47 seconds of cold, analytical thought, Yoon Kang Dae had let the only thing he ever loved slip through his fingers.
The silence that followed the abduction was not the controlled, clinical quiet Kang Dae usually curated. It was a jagged, hollow void that tasted of failure. He stood in the center of the ravaged safe room, the glass shards under his boots sounding like bone snapping. For the first time in his life, the analytical machinery of his mind had ground to a halt. The surgical boss, the man who moved people like chess pieces on a board of profit and loss, was dead. In his place stood a man whose skin felt too tight, a man who finally understood that his restraint had been his greatest enemy. He reached up and slowly pulled the glasses from his face. They had always been his filter, the lens through which he viewed the world as a series of cold equations. He looked at them for a heartbeat before crushing them in his fists, the frames snapping, the glass drawing a thin line of red across his palm. He didn't flinch. The pain was a grounding wire, a reminder that he was no longer calculating, he was feeling. "Sir?" one of his lieutenants whispered from the doorway, his voice trembling. "The Seoul merger. The families are demanding a response. They say if you don't return to the table, the syndicate is a pile of ash," Kang Dae rasped, his voice dropping into a register that sounded less like a man and more like a growl. He turned, and even his own men recoiled. The composure was gone. His tie was ripped away, his immaculate jacket discarded on the floor over the charred glove Marcus had left behind. "Call the technical teams. I want every satellite over the East Coast redirected. I want the deep web accounts we use for political leverage emptied, all of it." "But those resources are for the survival of the organization," the lieutenant protested. "Using them for a personal matter, it's breaking the code of the Kang lineage." "I am the code," Kang Dae said, stepping into the light, his eyes dark and wild. "I am burning it." For 3 years, he had lived by a set of rules designed to keep him untouchable. He had treated Zuri as a ghost to keep himself from realizing she was his soul. Now, he unleashed the full, terrifying weight of his empire, not for territory or pride, but for a vendetta that had no bottom. He authorized the use of black site surveillance and mobilized tactical units that were supposed to remain dormant for years. He didn't care about the exposure. He didn't care about the investigations or the civil war that would inevitably follow. He sat at the monitors, his bloody palms staining the keyboard as he bypassed security protocols he himself had written.
He was no longer a surgeon. He was a butcher with a digital blade. Every street camera, every hidden microphone, and every private server in the city was bent to his will. He watched the digital map of the city light up in a frantic red grid. "I found you, Marcus," he whispered, his eyes fixed on a grainy thermal signature moving toward the industrial docks. The cold, analytical mask was gone, replaced by a terrifying, singular focus. He wasn't looking for a tactical advantage anymore. He was looking for the man who had touched what was his. As he walked toward the armory, his footsteps echoing like a countdown, Yoon Kang Dae knew he would never be the same. The boss had stepped into the dark, and he wasn't coming back until the world that took her was nothing but a memory.
The industrial district at the edge of the docks was a graveyard of rusted iron and rotting timber, swallowed by a fog that tasted of salt and motor oil. Inside Warehouse 14, the air was different. It was thick with a scent of old blood and the sharp, unmistakable sting of sulfur. Zuri sat bound to a heavy steel chair in the center of the concrete floor, the overhead light swinging rhythmically, casting long, distorted shadows against the corrugated walls. Her braids were frayed, a thin trail of red marring her cheek, but her gaze remained a steady, defiant fire. Marcus Whitlock stood behind her, his hand resting heavy on her shoulder, a jagged combat knife glinting in the low light. He didn't look like a man in hiding. He looked like a man enjoying a theater performance. When the heavy iron doors at the far end of the warehouse groaned open, he didn't even flinch. Yoon Kang Dae stepped out of the mist. He was unrecognizable. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a tactical vest and dark fatigues. His face, usually shielded by the analytical glass of his spectacles, was raw and exposed, his eyes burning with a primal, focused light that made him look more like a demon than a businessman. He didn't come with an army. He came alone, carrying only a single metal briefcase and a heavy, weighted filance. "You're late, Kang Dae," Yoon shouted, his voice echoing off the high rafters. "I thought you were a man of precision." "The calculations changed," Kang Dae replied, his voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He stopped 10 paces away. "You wanted the keys to the kingdom, Marcus. You wanted the encryption codes for the Seoul merger and the offshore accounts. It's all here." He held up the briefcase. To the world, it represented billions of dollars and the architectural soul of the Kang syndicate. To Kang Dae, it was merely weight. "The empire for the Maid?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "You knew you were soft under that expensive wool. You're trading a throne for a girl who cleans your floors." "I'm trading a cage for a life," Kang Dae countered, his eyes locking onto Zuri's. In that moment, the surgical boss was truly gone. There was no risk assessment, no profit margin. There was only the agonizing, beautiful realization that he would watch the entire world burn if it meant she could breathe another minute of its air. "Let her go, and the briefcase is yours. The codes will activate at midnight. By then, I'll be gone, and you'll be the richest man in a hollow city." Marcus gripped Zuri's chin, forcing her to look up. "She's a high price, Kang Dae. Does she even know what you're giving up?" Zuri's voice broke through the tension, thin but unbreakable. "Don't do it, Kang Dae. Don't give him your world." "You are my world," he whispered, the admission finally cracking the last of his armor. Marcus's eyes gleamed with a predatory greed. He shoved Zuri forward, the chair skidding across the grit. "Slide the case." As the metal briefcase slid across the concrete, the silence in the warehouse became a physical weight. The trade was made. The Mafia boss had surrendered his crown for a secret he could no longer hide. But as Kang Dae reached out to catch Zuri, his eyes never left Marcus's. The empire was gone, but the war had just found its true purpose. The transition from the exchange to the execution was a blur of lethal, uncalculated instinct.
As Marcus reached for the briefcase, his greed momentarily blinding him, Kang Dae didn't wait for a fair fight. He moved with a violence that was no longer surgical or restrained. It was a storm long overdue. The first shot rang out, not from a distance, but from the backup weapon Kang Dae had concealed within the tactical vest. It struck the industrial steam pipe above Marcus, a deliberate diversion that filled the warehouse with a blinding white shroud. In the chaos, Kang Dae reached Zuri. He didn't pull her back. He shield-stepped in front of her, his body a wall of iron. Marcus, screaming in a mix of rage and scalded skin, swung the blade blindly through the mist. But the man who had sat behind glass for years, calculating risks, was gone. Kang Dae met the strike with a brutal efficiency, disarming Marcus with a sickening snap of bone. There was no clinical detachment left as Kang Dae pinned the enforcer against the corrugated wall. He didn't look at Marcus as a rival or a variable. He looked at him as the man who had dared to touch his soul. "You thought I was trading my world for hers," Kang Dae rasped, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that cut through the hiss of the steam. "You didn't realize she was the only reason I let the world exist at all." He didn't give Marcus the satisfaction of a final word. The end was swift, a single definitive act of protection that silenced the scent of sulfur forever. When the silence returned to the warehouse, it was no longer heavy with threat. Kang Dae turned to Zuri, his hands trembling as he reached out to undo her bindings. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look for his glasses. He simply pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged and raw. For the first time, the invisible woman and the surgical boss were gone, replaced by two people who had finally stopped running. The aftermath was a seismic shift that leveled the syndicate he had spent a decade building. By sacrificing the encryption codes, Kang Dae had effectively dismantled his own throne. But as he walked out of the warehouse into the early morning light, he didn't look back at the wreckage. He didn't care about the empty accounts or the fallen lieutenants. He was holding Zuri's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers in a public, unbreakable grip. Weeks later, the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate remained, but the glass was no longer a barrier. Kang Dae stood on the terrace, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink of a man who had survived a different kind of war. Zuri stood beside him, no longer in the black dress of a maid, but in a silk gown that caught the rising sun. He didn't watch her from the shadows anymore. He stood with her in the light. The man who had sworn she was just his maid had replaced his empire with a devotion that the world could finally see. As the city hummed in the distance, Kang Dae leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The silence between them was finally light, a physical weight lifted, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts that no longer had to beat in the dark. And just like that, the empire built on silence and surgical precision turned to ash. Marcus Whitlock thought he could use a nobody to break a kingpin, but he didn't realize that by touching Zuri, he was handing Yoon Kang Dae the match to burn the whole world down. Kang Dae Han traded his throne for her heartbeat, proving that some secrets are too powerful to be kept in the dark. He's no longer the man behind the glass. He's the man standing in the light, protecting the only thing that ever truly mattered. If you believe that some loves are worth losing everything for, smash that like button right now. Did Kang Dae make the right choice by letting his empire burn? Or did he just become more vulnerable than ever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know if you would have traded the crown for the girl. Don't forget to subscribe to the Afro-Korean Black Crown and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment of the war, the wealth, and the obsession.